The arrival and the quiet storm. The sky was painted in soft amber and violet hues, the final traces of the sun melting into the horizon as the airfield prepared for nightfall. A gentle breeze swept across the private tarmac, fluttering the edges of silk scarves and crisp uniforms worn by the ground crew. Private jets stood gleaming under the waning sunlight, polished to perfection, ready to transport the wealthy elite to destinations unknown. At the far end of the runway sat Elysian One, a sleek, silver jet belonging to Cobalt Global Holdings, a multinational empire whispered about in exclusive circles. The cabin crew stood at the top of the lowered stairs, their faces schooled into professional smiles, though their hands fidgeted nervously at their sides. There was a tension in the air, subtle but undeniable. At the base of the steps stood Captain Eric Marston, the senior pilot in charge of the flight. His posture was straight-backed, his shoulders squared, and his chin lifted just slightly higher than necessary. His uniform was immaculate, not a crease or speck out of place, his epaulets gleaming gold in the setting sun. His face, weathered but still arrogant, bore a permanent expression of thinly veiled impatience. He glanced at his watch, muttering under his breath. Typical. The word was quiet but sharp, cutting through the evening air like a rusted blade. She was late. Eric had been flying private jets for nearly 15 years. He prided himself on knowing the types who stepped aboard. New money always had a certain scent. They arrived overdressed, overexcited, clinging to wealth they had stumbled into. They were loud, demanding, desperate to prove they belonged. And they were often, in Eric's view, the wrong kind of people. When a long black Maybach S-Class finally glided onto the tarmac, Eric's lip curled ever so slightly. Of course, the car itself was an announcement, a trophy for those with something to prove. The uniformed driver stepped out first, moving with the kind of precision that only came from long service in wealth's shadow. The rear door opened, and from the plush interior emerged Monica Jameson. She moved with the grace of water, every step measured, her polished black heels clicking faintly on the pavement. Her tailored midnight blue coat fell in perfect folds around her legs, framing a crisp cream blouse and slim-fitting trousers that were neither flashy nor plain. Just perfect. A subtle diamond pin rested at her lapel, the only jewelry she wore. Her hair, a cascade of dark curls, framed a face both soft and steeled. Monica carried herself with an unspoken confidence, the type forged in rooms where being the only black woman meant you either learned to command the air around you, or you were ignored entirely. She chose the former. Trailing her was Grace, her assistant, a petite woman balancing a leather portfolio and a discreet designer bag. Monica's suitcase, a sleek, unmarked silver piece, was handled effortlessly by the driver. As they approached, Eric's eyes narrowed slightly. The weight of his assumptions clung to her before she even reached the stairs. Entitled, overindulged, new money. He'd seen it 1,000 times before. He had no idea who she was, but that didn't matter. He had already decided. Monica was steps away when she spoke, her voice soft but clear. "Good evening, Captain." Eric didn't respond. His eyes flicked past her, not meeting her gaze, not acknowledging her presence. It was subtle, the kind of microaggression polished into muscle memory over decades. Grace hesitated, exchanging a brief glance with Monica, but Monica's face didn't shift. Not an inch. Instead, she offered the faintest smile, her poise untouched. The cabin crew at the top of the stairs noticed the tension, their own smiles faltering as they watched the exchange. They had flown with Eric before. They knew his tendencies, but his skill in the cockpit had always shielded him from consequence. Monica ascended the steps, accepting the warm, if slightly awkward, greetings of the attendants. Grace followed, her face tight with barely restrained frustration. Inside, the cabin was a masterpiece of understated luxury. Cream leather seats, warm wood paneling, and soft lighting that gave the space a serene glow. A single glass of chilled water waited at Monica's seat beside a small vase holding a white orchid. Everything was perfect. except the air. Monica settled into her seat with effortless grace, crossing her legs and letting her hands rest loosely in her lap. Her eyes flicked around the cabin, not with the wide-eyed wonder Eric would have expected, but with the calm assessment of someone who had seen better, worse, and everything in between. The flight attendant approached, her smile genuine if uncertain. "Mrs. Jameson, we're honored to have you with us. Please let us know if you need anything." "Thank you," Monica replied, her smile kind, her voice smooth. Behind her, Grace settled into her seat, but her hands fidgeted, flipping through her tablet, organizing documents that didn't need organizing. The silence stretched, the engines warming outside, filling the quiet with a low, steady hum. The cockpit door opened. Eric stepped out just long enough to make the pre-flight announcement, his gaze sweeping the cabin, lingering a fraction too long on Monica. But he still didn't greet her directly. "We'll be departing shortly," he said, his voice professional but cold. "Please remain seated for takeoff." Then, just as quickly, he was gone. The door shut with a quiet click. Grace leaned across the aisle, her voice low. "That was deliberate, right?" Monica's smile didn't waver. "Of course. You want me to?" "No need," Monica said softly. "Let him show us who he is." Grace's brow furrowed. "But why let him get away with it?" Monica's gaze softened, her voice calm. "Because they always overstep. Always." She turned her attention back to the window, her reflection framed by the deepening twilight. It was a lesson she had learned 1,000 times over. There was no need to force a confrontation. The truly arrogant always dug their own graves. The engines roared to life, and the jet began its slow taxi down the runway. In the cockpit, Eric's knuckles tightened around the yoke. He could feel her calm presence through the door, and it grated on him like sandpaper. Women like her didn't belong here, at least, not in his mind. She didn't fit the mold of the passengers he preferred to serve. Too composed, too confident, too unapologetically herself. The jet lifted, slicing through the sky, leaving the earth below as the first stars emerged overhead. In the cabin, Monica leaned back, her posture relaxed, her face serene. She knew the turbulence wouldn't come from the sky. It would come from a man who had no idea how easily his power could slip through his fingers. For now, she waited. After all, the most powerful strikes came when the opponent had no idea they were already losing. Cracks in the cockpit. The private jet sliced through the darkening sky, leaving behind the fading lights of the runway below. The cabin was a cocoon of muted luxury, every detail designed to exude elegance without excess. Cream leather, polished mahogany, soft recessed lighting. It was a space meant for quiet power. Yet in the stillness, an invisible tension hummed beneath the surface, like the faint, high-pitched whine of an engine under strain. Monica Jameson sat in her seat, composed as ever, her hands loosely clasped in her lap. The soft vibration of the aircraft's ascent pressed her gently into the seat, but she showed no reaction. Her eyes drifted out the window, where the sky darkened from bruised lavender to the ink of night. Beside her, Grace still fidgeted, the tablet resting on her lap barely touched. The assistant's fingers hovered over the screen, though her mind was elsewhere, back on the tarmac, reliving the wordless insult that had passed between Captain Eric Marston and her boss. "That man," Grace murmured, voice pitched low, though no one else was nearby. "I've never seen someone so boldly disrespectful and so smug about it." Monica didn't respond immediately. Instead, she ran her thumb along the smooth edge of her glass, the chilled water inside still untouched. Finally, she spoke, her voice as soft and steady as always. "You have." Grace blinked. "I have." "You've seen men like him before," Monica continued. "Different uniforms, different titles, same insecurity." She turned her gaze slightly, meeting Grace's eyes. "They think power comes from being the loudest voice in the room, from making people see them. But real power doesn't need to shout." Grace's brow furrowed. "Still, it's not right." Monica's smile was faint, almost imperceptible. It's not. But that doesn't mean we chase every battle. Before Grace could respond, the cockpit door cracked open again. Eric stood in the narrow passage, his hand resting on the frame, his expression a polished mask of professionalism that couldn't quite hide the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "Cabin crew, prepare for cruise," he said flatly, his gaze sliding past Monica like she was a shadow. "Expected flight time is just over 4 hours. Weather is clear." He didn't wait for a response. The door shut behind him with a quiet click, sealing him back into his private kingdom. Monica's fingers traced the stem of her glass again. "He's trying to remind us he's in control." Grace huffed softly. "Control of what?" "The plane." "Congratulations, that's his job." "It's more than that," Monica said. "People like him don't just want control of the plane. They want control of how they're perceived. And right now, he doesn't like the way we're looking at him." Grace shifted uneasily. "I'm looking at him like an arrogant fool." "And that," Monica said with a small smile, "is exactly what unsettles him." In the cockpit, Eric Marston sat with his hands locked on the yoke, even though the plane was cruising smoothly under autopilot. The gentle glow of the instruments lit his face in hues of soft green and orange, making the deep lines around his mouth and eyes more pronounced. Beside him, First Officer Adam Coates sat quietly, trying to focus on the readings in front of him. Adam was new to private aviation, still finding his footing, but one thing had become abundantly clear during his short time flying with Eric. The captain's ego left no room for anyone else's air. "She's too comfortable back there," Eric muttered, though his voice was barely above a whisper. Adam glanced sideways. "Who?" Eric's jaw tightened. "Her. That woman. Sitting there like she owns the place." Adam was careful with his response. "Well, doesn't she? Or at least her husband does." "That's exactly the problem," Eric snapped, his voice sharper now. "She's only here because of him. She didn't earn this." Adam's fingers hovered uncertainly above the throttle controls. "Sir, I don't think it's really our place to." "It's always our place," Eric interrupted. "This plane. This whole world. It's supposed to be for people who earned their way here, not for people who married well." The bitterness in his voice made Adam sit back, unsure how to respond. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken grievances. In truth, Eric didn't know a thing about Monica Jameson. He hadn't read the passenger profile. He didn't know her background, her achievements, or the sheer weight of the corporate empire she controlled alongside her husband. To him, her calm confidence was a threat, not because of what she'd done, but because of what she represented: change. The kind of change that left men like Eric behind. The quiet reversal. Back in the cabin, the attendants moved with practiced grace, offering fresh beverages, adjusting the lighting, ensuring every detail was perfect. Monica accepted none of it. She was content with her glass of water and the quiet hum of the engines. Grace, however, couldn't sit still. "Do you want me to draft a formal complaint?" she asked softly. "We have enough already, from the tarmac to the way he spoke, or didn't speak, to you." Monica shook her head. "No need." Grace's brow furrowed. "Why not?" "Because," Monica said, her gaze steady, "he'll make his own case for us." Grace didn't fully understand, but she trusted Monica's instincts. After all, Monica hadn't built her career by confronting every insult head-on. Her power lay in patience, in watching, waiting, and understanding that some enemies defeat themselves the moment they believe they're untouchable. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, the soft glow shifting to a warmer hue. Monica leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, not to sleep but to center herself. She had encountered men like Eric her entire life, gatekeepers who mistook their proximity to power for power itself. What they never understood was that real power doesn't need a gate. The descent begins. In the cockpit, Eric's frustration simmered just beneath the surface. Every time he glanced at the cabin camera feed, Monica was there, calm, poised, untouched. The lack of reaction infuriated him more than any confrontation could have. She was supposed to complain. She was supposed to make demands. That's how people like her acted, or so he believed. But she didn't. She just waited. His fingers hovered over the intercom switch. He could make some subtle remark, remind her who was in charge, but some part of him held back. There were lines even he knew not to cross. But the more she remained unshaken, the more tempted he was to cross them anyway. "Captain," Adam's voice was cautious, "we're still on a smooth track. Do you want me to monitor while you take a break?" Eric's jaw clenched. "No." "Are you sure? It's a long flight." I said no. Adam fell silent. There was no point arguing. Whatever was going on between the captain and their passenger, it was personal and getting worse. The calm before the storm. Monica's phone buzzed softly. She glanced at the screen, a single message glowing against the darkened cabin. "Message from D. Jameson. Landed ahead of you," everything said. "See you soon." A faint smile touched her lips. "David's team is already at the destination," Monica said quietly. Grace brightened. "Good. Maybe they can handle Captain Ego for us." Monica shook her head, her smile turning just slightly sharper. "They won't have to." Grace frowned. "Why?" "Because," Monica said, "he's going to handle himself." The private jet cut through the sky, leaving nothing but silence and expectation in its wake. The air around them was still, but the storm was already gathering. Monica could feel it. Some lessons don't need to be taught. They teach themselves, and Captain Eric Marston was about to learn one he'd never forget. Flight paths and fragile egos. The hum of the engines settled into a steady, low vibration as Elysian 1 cruised above the blanket of clouds. Far below, the flickering city lights disappeared beneath a layer of mist, the earth obscured from view. The sky, vast and unbothered, stretched infinitely ahead, indifferent to the tensions brewing within the cabin. Monica Jameson reclined slightly in her seat, her posture effortlessly elegant. Her fingers traced the edge of her leather portfolio, the subtle texture a familiar comfort. Beside her, Grace had finally stopped fidgeting, though her brow remained creased with unresolved frustration. "You're too calm," Grace murmured, breaking the silence between them. Monica's eyes didn't leave the window. "Calm is a choice." Grace leaned in slightly. "But doesn't it bother you? The way he acts, like you're invisible, unless you're someone he thinks deserves respect." Monica's smile was faint but unwavering. "Of course it bothers me, but people like him don't need me to punish them." Grace's brow furrowed. "Then who will?" Monica turned, meeting her assistant's worried gaze. "They punish themselves. Always." Grace opened her mouth to respond, but was interrupted by the quiet hiss of the cockpit door opening. Captain Eric Marston stepped into the cabin again, though this time his approach was slower, almost cautious, as if he were debating whether or not to acknowledge Monica at all. His hesitation, however, was fleeting. "Everything to your satisfaction, Mrs. Jameson." His voice was clipped, the words strained through clenched teeth. It was the first time he used her name. There was no warmth in the greeting, no genuine hospitality, just obligation. Monica offered him a calm smile. "The flight is smooth. Thank you." Her words were perfectly polite, but her tone was impenetrable, offering nothing for Eric to grasp, no foothold for his ego to climb. She had given him exactly what he had asked for: civility. And yet, it felt like a dismissal. Eric's fingers twitched at his side. "We'll be arriving slightly ahead of schedule," he added, a thin layer of smugness slipping into his voice. "Weather is on our side." Monica inclined her head. "Excellent." Again, nothing. No praise, no gratitude for his supposed skill, just effortless, unbothered poise. Eric stood there a moment too long, his frustration coiling beneath his skin, before he turned sharply and retreated back into the cockpit. The door closed with a muted click. but the tension it left behind felt louder than any slam. In the cockpit, cracks in command. The cockpit was dim, bathed in the soft glow of instrument panels and navigation screens. The sky ahead was clear, the flight path smooth, yet Eric Marston felt anything but calm. His grip on the yoke was too tight, knuckles paling under the strain. He could still feel Monica's presence, even with the door shut between them. She was back there, sitting in that seat like she owned the sky itself. Silent, self-possessed, untouchable. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't demanded anything. She hadn't even called attention to his dismissiveness. That was the worst part. She refused to give him anything to fight against, and it was driving him insane. "You all right, Captain?" First Officer Adam Coates's voice was tentative, careful, as if approaching a wounded animal. Eric didn't respond at first. His eyes flicked to the small cabin camera feed. Monica, sipping her water, legs crossed, her expression smooth as silk. Grace, beside her, scrolling her tablet with idle fingers. They were too comfortable. "She thinks she's better than me," Eric muttered, almost too low for Adam to hear. Adam glanced sideways. "What?" Eric's jaw clenched. "Nothing. Just focus." Adam hesitated. "You know, she hasn't actually." "I said focus." The growl in Eric's voice silenced further comment, but the damage was done. The seed had been planted. Even Adam could see it now. Eric wasn't upset over anything Monica had done. He was upset because she hadn't done anything. The quiet weight of patience. Back in the cabin, Monica's phone vibrated softly against the polished wood table beside her seat. She glanced down at the screen, her husband's name glowing in the dim light. "David Jameson. Touchdown confirmed. We'll be on site when you land." Monica's smile softened. "David's already there?" Grace asked. "He is." Grace brightened. "Good. Maybe his presence will settle things." Monica's smile didn't fade, but a flicker of something sharper glinted in her eyes. "It will. Just not the way you think." Grace tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Monica turned, folding her hands in her lap. "The most powerful moments are the quiet ones, the ones where people reveal exactly who they are." Grace still looked puzzled, but she had been with Monica long enough to know better than to press. The lesson would reveal itself. Altitude and attitude. As the flight continued, Eric's agitation bloomed into something darker. Every minute that passed without Monica reacting felt like a personal affront. Every glance at the cabin feed was a reminder that she wasn't impressed, wasn't intimidated. He needed to shift the balance, remind her who was in control. Flipping the intercom switch, Eric's voice filled the cabin, artificially calm. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're maintaining smooth skies ahead, though there may be some minor turbulence as we approach the descent phase. Please remain seated with seat belts fastened for your safety." The message was unnecessary. There was no turbulence expected, but it was a chance to project authority into the cabin, to remind Monica that he controlled the plane. Monica's brow lifted slightly, her only visible reaction. She took a slow sip of her water and set the glass down with deliberate care. "He's trying to rattle you," Grace whispered. "He's trying," Monica agreed. "Is it working?" Monica's smile was almost indulgent. Of course not. The insecurity spiral. In the cockpit, Adam's discomfort deepened. He had flown with difficult captains before, but something about Eric's fixation on Monica felt personal in a way that bordered on dangerous. "Captain, everything's stable. There's no turbulence expected in this corridor," Adam offered. "I'm just preparing for any changes," Eric snapped. Adam's hands curled around the armrests. "You sure you're not preparing for something else?" Eric's head whipped toward him, eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Adam chose his words carefully. "It's just, you seem really focused on Mrs. Jameson." Eric sneered. "I'm focused on my job." Adam's silence was damning. Both men knew the truth. Eric had turned the flight into a personal proving ground, and Monica hadn't even acknowledged the battle. Final descent. A lesson in gravity. As the plane began its gradual descent, Monica adjusted her seat slightly. The view outside shifted, stars giving way to the faint grid of city lights below, blurred through thin streaks of cloud. Grace was still tense, her fingers twitching against her tablet. What happens when we land? Monica's smile was unreadable. That depends entirely on him. Grace blinked. On Captain Marston. Monica nodded. He's already chosen his path. All I have to do is watch him walk it. The words hung between them, heavy with promise. The first crack breaks open. In the cockpit, Eric's fingers hovered over the intercom switch again. His mind spun, desperate to reclaim some version of control. A final message. A reminder. Something. Before he could press the button, the cabin communication panel lit up. Incoming message. Elysian Ops. Direct from D. Jameson office. Eric's stomach dropped. He opened the message, heart pounding. We'll be greeting you upon landing. Formal review of flight conduct immediately following. The words blurred as Eric's pulse roared in his ears. Captain, Adam asked softly. Eric's voice was hoarse. Just focus on the landing. But the landing wasn't the fall Eric needed to worry about. The real fall had already begun. Descent into consequence. The soft glow of the cabin lights dimmed slightly as Elysian 1 began its gentle descent toward its destination. Outside the windows, the clouds thinned, revealing the distant sprawl of city lights below, a constellation of gold and silver stretching endlessly into the night. Monica Jameson sat with her hands resting lightly on the leather armrests, her posture impeccable even as the plane tilted ever so slightly. Beside her, Grace glanced down at the notifications popping up on her tablet, arrival schedules, ground transport updates, and one message flagged as high priority. Grace's brow creased. It's from David's office, she whispered. Monica turned her head slightly, her expression unchanging. What does it say? Grace read aloud. Confirmation. Senior Ops team will be on the ground to greet Mrs. Jameson. Immediate debrief with Captain Marston upon arrival. A faint smile tugged at the corner of Monica's mouth. Perfect timing. Grace's eyes flicked toward the cockpit door. He's going to unravel when he sees them. Monica's smile didn't widen, but there was a sharpness to it now, a quiet, unspoken certainty. He's unraveling already. In the cockpit, a spiral in real time. Inside the cockpit, Captain Eric Marston was gripping the yoke like it was the only thing anchoring him to reality. His face was pale, beads of sweat clinging to his temple despite the air-conditioned cool of the flight deck. The words on the message screen from Elysian Ops had burned into his mind, cycling over and over like an alarm he couldn't silence. Immediate debrief. Formal review of flight conduct. His stomach churned. He'd flown hundreds of flights without incident. At least, none that mattered enough to trigger a formal review. But this wasn't a review about his flying. This was about her. About the woman sitting calmly in his cabin, watching him dismantle himself piece by piece. She's not even doing anything, Eric muttered under his breath, barely aware he was speaking aloud. First Officer Adam Coates shifted uneasily beside him. Captain, are you okay? Eric's head snapped toward him. I'm fine. Adam hesitated, then carefully asked, Is this about Mrs. Jameson? Everything's about people like her. Eric spat, his voice lower now, like a man confessing his darkest secret. They walk onto these jets, act like they own the world, and expect everyone to bow. Adam's brow furrowed. But she hasn't done anything. She doesn't have to, Eric said through gritted teeth. It's the way they carry themselves. No respect. No gratitude. Like we're invisible. Adam didn't reply, but his silence said everything. Eric was fighting a battle with his own reflection, projecting all his insecurities onto a woman who had barely spoken a word to him. And deep down, Eric knew it. That was what made him hate her calm even more. The air below and power above. Monica had spent her entire career in spaces where men like Eric thought they were the gatekeepers, offices, boardrooms, negotiations where she was the only black woman at the table. Every time, it was the same script. They underestimated her, dismissed her, ignored her presence until it became impossible to ignore. She didn't shout. She didn't beg for attention. She simply existed, unapologetically, confidently, and with a quiet power that made the gatekeepers uncomfortable. This flight was no different. The cockpit door might have separated them physically, but Monica could feel Eric's unraveling through every unnecessary announcement, every awkward glance, and every slight twist of disdain in his voice. She didn't need to confront him. He was confronting himself. "Grace," Monica said softly, "do you remember what I told you when you started working with me?" Grace blinked, pulled from her anxious thoughts. "Of course. You said power isn't about who shouts the loudest." Monica nodded, her fingers resting on the polished edge of the armrest. "And what did I say it was about?" Grace recited, her voice quieter. "It's about who controls the silence." Monica's smile was warm but edged with steel. "Exactly." The final announcement. The intercom crackled, and Eric's voice filled the cabin once more. This time, there was an unmistakable tremor beneath the practiced professionalism. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent into New York. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all electronic devices are secured. We anticipate smooth skies, and we will be on the ground shortly. Thank you for flying with us." Grace exhaled sharply, her fingers gripping the armrest. Even his voice sounds rattled. Monica didn't respond. She didn't need to. The cabin lights brightened slightly as the attendants moved through the cabin, checking seatbelts and securing loose items. Monica's glass of water remained untouched, the condensation beading neatly along its crystal surface. It was the only thing on her table, as if to emphasize how little she needed to establish her presence. Power didn't come from demanding space. It came from occupying it without apology. On approach, crumbling facades. As the plane descended, Eric's breathing grew shallow. The closer they got to the runway, the closer he came to the inevitable confrontation waiting for him after touchdown. He could picture them already. David Jameson's team, standing at the edge of the tarmac, suited, professional, unimpressed. There would be no shouting, no accusations, just calm questions and clipped responses, a surgical dismantling of the man he'd built himself up to be. Eric had spent years constructing his identity as a pilot who knew his place, above the cabin crew, above the ground staff, above the passengers who didn't fit the mold. But his place had never been above power. And Monica Jameson was power, whether he acknowledged it or not. The runway lights rose into view, glowing softly against the dark, and Eric's hands trembled slightly on the controls. Touchdown. A silent reckoning. The landing itself was smooth, perfect, in fact. But it didn't matter. As the plane taxied toward its private hangar, the row of sleek black SUVs waiting on the tarmac was impossible to miss. Men in dark suits stood beside them, their posture relaxed but purposeful. They weren't just here for Monica. They were here for him. The moment the engine spooled down and the seatbelt sign switched off, Monica stood. She moved with the same deliberate grace she had shown since the moment she stepped on board. Grace followed, her nervous energy tempered by Monica's calm. The cabin door opened, and the warm night air filled the space. One of David's senior advisors stood at the bottom of the stairs, waiting with a polite but unreadable expression. Monica stepped onto the stairs without pause, descending smoothly. As her heels touched the tarmac, she turned slightly, offering Grace a quiet smile. "See." No shouting, no raised voices. Grace smiled back, understanding now. Just silence. Monica inclined her head. Controlled silence. The walk of shame. Eric stood in the doorway, reluctant to leave the sanctuary of the plane. But there was no avoiding it. One of David's senior team members, a man with a tablet and a knowing expression, gestured for him to follow. With every step down the stairs, Eric felt his chest constrict. Monica was already standing beside David Jameson, her hand resting lightly in his. They spoke softly, exchanging smiles, as if the flight, and Eric's unraveling, hadn't happened at all. That was the worst part. She hadn't needed to fight him. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She had let him destroy himself with his own fear and insecurity. As Eric reached the bottom of the stairs, David's advisor stepped forward. "Captain Marston, we'll need a few minutes of your time for a post-flight review." Eric opened his mouth, but no words came. Behind him, the plane, his domain, loomed in the night, empty now, powerless without him. And beside him, Monica Jameson, calm, radiant, unbothered, stepped into the waiting SUV. Without ever saying a word, she had won. The weight of silent power. The night air hung still and heavy around the private hangar, the muffled hum of jet engines fading into the background as Elysian 1 came to its final stop. The soft click of seat belts being unfastened echoed through the now silent cabin. But even that sound felt muted beneath the invisible weight hanging in the air. The black SUVs lined up on the tarmac stood like sentinels, sleek, dark, and unmoving. Their headlights formed a perfect row of unblinking eyes, reflecting the faint sheen of moisture clinging to the pavement. Monica Jameson descended the jet stairs with the same unshakable grace she carried through the entire flight. There was no urgency to her steps, no sense of triumph in her posture. She simply walked, the way a queen moves through her own palace, at home, unbothered, owning every inch of ground she touched. Her husband, David Jameson, stood waiting near the lead vehicle, tall, composed, and radiating a quiet authority that matched Monica's own. David's presence had the effect of silencing conversations without needing to utter a word. When Monica reached him, his hand rested gently on the small of her back, a gesture that was both affectionate and symbolic. "You are protected. You are respected. You belong here." Grace followed close behind Monica, her movements more hurried, her nerves far less contained. Her eyes flicked anxiously toward the cockpit, where Captain Eric Marston remained frozen at the top of the stairs. "Is he coming down?" Grace whispered. Monica's gaze drifted upward, locking briefly with Eric's through the open doorway. His face, barely visible in the dim light, was taut with indecision, caught between the remnants of his pride and the weight of looming consequences. "He will," Monica said softly, "because there's nowhere else to go." Inside the cockpit, the wall closing in, Eric Marston's hands gripped the back of the co-pilot's seat so tightly his knuckles ached. His breath came too fast, chest rising and falling in uneven bursts. He had flown this route dozens of times, landed in this very hangar without incident. But tonight was different. Because tonight, he wasn't just landing a plane. He was landing into judgment. Through the small window, he could see the assembled figures on the tarmac. David Jameson's team. There was no mistaking them. Their posture, their presence, the way they didn't need to bark orders to command attention. They weren't just here for protocol. They were here for him. "Captain," First Officer Adam Coates said quietly, "They're waiting." Eric didn't respond. His mind spun in frantic circles, grasping at excuses, explanations, anything that might soften what was coming. What had she even said? He couldn't know for sure. Monica Jameson had barely spoken a word to him the entire flight. That was what made it worse. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't accused him. She had let the silence speak. And somehow, that silence had been loud enough to summon a formal review. "Captain." Adam tried again. Eric forced himself to move. His legs felt heavy, each step down the narrow aisle a march towards something inevitable. His breath caught when he reached the open door, his gaze locking onto Monica and David below. They stood side by side, power wrapped around them like armor, neither confrontational nor passive. Just there. The way real power always was. On the tarmac, The gathering storm. Eric's shoes hit the pavement, each step a hollow echo against the concrete. The night felt colder now, though the air was still. The suited figures flanking David stepped forward slightly as Eric approached, not threatening, but blocking all other paths. There was only one way this could go. David's gaze met Eric's directly. There was no anger there, no shouting, no dramatic accusations, just calm expectation, as though the verdict had already been delivered, and now they were just formalizing the paperwork. "Captain Marston," David said, his voice smooth and even. "Walk with me." Eric's throat felt dry, but he managed a stiff nod. He fell into step beside David, the two men walking just far enough from the others to have the illusion of privacy. Monica remained near the SUV, her posture relaxed, her presence inescapable. David didn't speak right away. The silence stretched between them like a wire, taut and unyielding. Finally, he spoke. "We've received reports," David said calmly, "about your demeanor on this flight." Eric swallowed. "Sir, if I may." David raised a hand, not to silence him, but to guide him. "I'm not interested in excuses. I want your version." Eric's mind scrambled. What version? There was no incident to explain. Monica hadn't complained. She hadn't confronted him. All he had done was exist, or so he tried to tell himself. "I treated Mrs. Jameson professionally," Eric said, his voice thin and strained. "I followed all standard protocols." David's head tilted slightly. "Did you greet her when she boarded?" Eric's mouth opened and closed. Did you acknowledge her presence at all?" Eric's silence was the only answer needed. David nodded once, as though ticking off a mental checklist. "You've flown for this company a long time, Captain. Long enough to know that we don't just transport passengers. We provide a standard of experience." "I understand," Eric said quickly. "It was a misunderstanding." "No," David said quietly. "It was a choice." Eric's stomach twisted painfully. I've read the full report," David continued, his voice still calm. "The crew, your co-pilot, even the ground team. They all noticed." Eric's pulse pounded in his ears. "With respect, sir, I don't see how my demeanor could warrant." "Your demeanor," David interrupted smoothly, "is a reflection of how you view our clients, and how you view my wife." Eric's breath caught. There it was, the unspoken truth laid bare in the cold night air. "This isn't about a single slight," David continued. "It's about a pattern, one that's been noticed more than once." Eric's mind reeled. More than once. "This flight was a test," David said, his voice soft. "And you failed." Eric's knees felt weak. Sir, I've always been professional. This was a misunderstanding." David stopped walking, turning to face him directly. "Do you know why you're really here, Captain?" Eric couldn't answer. "You're here because you underestimated someone who didn't need to shout to be heard." Eric's breath came faster now, his desperation clawing to the surface. "Sir, please. I've been with the company for years. This can't be the end." David's expression didn't shift. "It already is." Eric's vision blurred. "Please." "You're dismissed," David said softly, effective immediately. There was no anger, no theatrics, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the weight of a closed door. Eric stood frozen, the weight of years of unchecked arrogance collapsing on top of him. The gatekeeper had been removed from his own gate. Back at the SUV, closing the door, Monica stood beside the open SUV door, the night breeze lifting a strand of hair from her shoulder. She watched Eric's defeat in silence, not with satisfaction, but with a calm inevitability. Grace stood beside her, awed. He didn't even fight. Monica's smile was faint. There was no fight to win. Grace exhaled, shaking her head. "He underestimated you." Monica's gaze turned toward her husband, who was already walking back to her side. "He underestimated himself." As David reached her, Monica stepped into the SUV, settling into the seat with the same ease she had shown in the cabin. David slid in beside her, their hands briefly touching in the space between them. The door closed with a soft, final click. The SUVs pulled away from the hangar, leaving Eric Marston standing alone on the tarmac, a man brought down not by a battle, but by silence. Because real power doesn't shout, it stands, and when it's time to move, it moves without needing permission. The power of walking away. The convoy of sleek black SUVs glided through the private airport gates, their tinted windows reflecting the golden glow of runway lights. Inside the lead vehicle, Monica Jameson sat silently, her back straight, her hands resting loosely in her lap. The cool air from the vents kissed her skin, but her thoughts were far from the comfort of the luxury cabin. Beside her, David Jameson sat with his phone in hand, scanning final updates from his executive team. His presence, calm and steady, was a perfect mirror of Monica's own. They didn't need to discuss what had happened. There were no shocked revelations, no questions hanging between them. They both understood what Eric Marston had never been able to grasp. The loudest voices often silenced themselves. Grace was in the SUV behind them, her heart still racing despite the outcome. She couldn't shake the image of Eric standing alone on the tarmac, his world crumbling in real time. But what left her more stunned was Monica's effortless handling of the entire ordeal, from the moment they stepped onto the plane to the final click of the SUV door. She hadn't needed to raise her voice. She hadn't needed to make a demand. She had simply let him reveal himself. The quiet aftermath. The following morning, Monica sat in the corner of her husband's private office, her tablet balanced on her lap. Sunlight spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows, bathing the room in a gentle warmth. Outside, the skyline of Manhattan stretched endlessly, a tapestry of glass, steel, and ambition. David stood near the window, speaking quietly to his chief operating officer, reviewing the final report from the flight. The entire incident had been documented with care, from the ground crew's initial observations to the cockpit audio logs, capturing Eric's clipped, disdainful remarks. There was no need for embellishment. The facts spoke loudly enough. When the call ended, David turned to Monica, his expression softening. He's officially terminated. His credentials are being revoked across all subsidiaries. Monica nodded, but there was no satisfaction in her face, just quiet certainty. It was never about firing him, she said. I know, David agreed, but it's necessary. She set the tablet aside, leaning back slightly. He fired himself the moment he decided who I was before I said a word. David's brow lifted slightly. Some people would have confronted him directly. Monica's smile was faint. That's exactly what he was hoping for. If I had reacted, even once, it would have fed his story, made me the aggressor in his mind. Silence, though. Silence leaves people alone with their own reflections. David crossed the room, settling onto the edge of her chair. And you're good at holding up that mirror. It's not a skill, Monica said softly. It's survival. David took her hand, his thumb tracing a small circle over her skin. They had spent years building their empire, together. They had weathered storms no one else saw, walked into rooms they weren't expected to occupy, and claimed space without asking for permission. People had underestimated them both, but especially her. Eric Marston's reckoning. In a dimly lit apartment on the outskirts of the city, Eric Marston sat alone, his uniform jacket crumpled on the arm of the couch. His phone lay silent on the table. No new messages, no missed calls, just an eerie, suffocating quiet. His career wasn't just over at Cobalt Global Holdings. David Jameson's reach extended far beyond that single company. Within hours, word had spread through the tight-knit world of private aviation. Pilots whispered to each other. Flight directors quietly removed his name from their call lists. Companies flagged his personnel file. It wasn't just a firing. It was an erasure. Years of work, gone, not in a blaze of scandal, but in the cold, suffocating silence of professional exile. Eric poured himself another drink, But even the alcohol didn't soften the sharp edge of humiliation carving into his chest. He had done it to himself. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting match, no incident to excuse his behavior. All Monica Jameson had done was exist. That was what haunted him the most. She hadn't fought him. She had simply let him fall. A lesson in stillness. Back at Cobalt Global's Manhattan headquarters, Monica stood on the balcony of her corner office, her eyes tracing the skyline. The city was alive with movement, cars crawling along avenues, pedestrians weaving through sidewalks, cranes shifting steel high above the streets. She could feel Grace behind her, hovering just inside the office, waiting. "Go ahead," Monica said softly, not turning around. Grace stepped onto the balcony, her expression hesitant. "I know you're probably tired of me asking this, but I still don't get it." Monica's smile curved slightly. "What don't you get?" Grace exhaled, frustrated at herself. "How you knew? From the moment you saw him on the tarmac, you knew how it would end." Monica's gaze stayed on the horizon. "It's not magic. It's not even instinct." "Then what?" Monica turned to her, her expression gentle but unwavering. "It's experience." Grace frowned. "Experience with what?" Monica's smile was tinged with both warmth and sadness, with men who mistake proximity to power for power itself. Grace's brows lifted slightly. "Eric Marston thought standing near people like me made him important," Monica continued. "He thought the uniform, the title, the authority over the flight made him the most powerful person on that plane." "But it didn't," Grace said softly. "No," Monica agreed, "because power isn't about being loud. It's not about control or forcing people to see you. Real power is knowing exactly who you are, even when the world tries to convince you otherwise." Grace absorbed it quietly, leaning on the railing beside her. "So, you didn't fight him because you didn't need to." Monica nodded. "I didn't need to. He fought himself. The quiet power of walking away." Later that afternoon, Monica and David walked through the lobby of their building, side by side. Staff nodded in respect as they passed, but neither of them required it. Their presence was enough. As they stepped outside, the cool air filled Monica's lungs. The city moved around them, bustling, honking, shouting, life unfolding in all its messy, beautiful noise. Grace followed a few steps behind, watching as Monica and David moved like they were part of the city itself, rooted and fluid, belonging wherever they stood. They approached their waiting car, but before stepping inside, Monica turned to Grace. "Want to know the hardest lesson I ever learned?" Monica asked. Grace straightened. "What?" Monica's smile was small, but its weight was immeasurable. "The people who scream for attention are never the ones in charge." Grace tilted her head. "So who is?" Monica's gaze drifted up to the towering buildings, the sky beyond them, stretching endless and open. "The ones who don't need to scream at all." With that, Monica stepped into the car. David followed, the door closing softly behind them. Grace stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer, the noise of the city swirling around her. And somewhere in the back of her mind, she realized the truth. Power didn't live in loud voices or public battles. Power lived in quiet certainty. And in the end, the people who truly held it never needed to prove it. They simply were.